I found the Randos United channel and started listening to a lot of those conversations as a byproduct maybe of your conversation with Nathan, the digital Gnosis guy
Yep.
that we had on. And what's funny is when I listened to your conversation with Nathan, I couldn't figure out like how you guys got connected. And then I saw his YouTube channel and I listened to his video where he was talking about you. And I thought, wow, they were talking so amicably on Paul's channel. I didn't know that he was, lambasting you on his channel or whatever, and that's, like kind of like I didn't know that he had views contrary to you when I first listened to him, essentially, and so I found, I basically, I thought I kind of, like the idea that, or I guess rather that, I've seen a lot of like maybe somewhat people who don't share your views per se come on your channel, and I've never seen you not have an amicable conversation, basically. And so I was kind of just curious and wanted to ask you a few questions, especially as, we're in times now where people are the least amicable they've ever been, maybe, or the least charitable in in terms of conversation, maybe, or maybe that's just the people that I've experienced in my own social circles. But it seems that we're in sort of like contentious times, let's say, like, because I have a pretty radically conservative and socially conservative family who, like in the events of like the Capitol Hill sort of that whole business there, are still sort of like up in arms about everything in terms of like they're on the side of the people who stormed the Capitol and all of that, and so it's just your style is interesting to me in the sense that like you seem to be able to disarm even people who disagree with you.
Well, I think part of it is the medium.
Mm.
When we're talking about people, it's a lot easier to be dismissive, contentious, contemptible than when we're talking to people, especially if we have the cameras on. And so part of the thing that I did on the Discord server is I've sort of been trying to create a culture where people turn the cameras on, because you do, we have these mirror neurons, and if I say something that hurts you, I have to see, and I see the pain on your face. I feel some of that pain. One of the things I did fairly early on with our church, because this church had a long history of contention and turmoil, and often those bad events which tore at the fabric of the church happened at congregational meetings. And the way congregational meetings usually work is that everybody sits in the rows like they do in church, and they all face forward. So then they stand up and they say ugly things at the back of people's faces. And so if I knew we were going to have a difficult congregational meeting, I first did was make a whole bunch of circles in the sanctuary and say, before we have a vote or anything like this to discuss this topic, I want to break you up into groups of 6 or 8 or 10, and I want you guys to talk about this, and then I might seed people of the opposing parties in. So let's start our conversation about this contentious issue face to face in small groups. Nobody has a microphone. Nobody's going to grandstand. If you want to say something ugly about the ideas or the person with whom you share a church, you need to say it to their face in front of other people around. And you better believe in most cases, people will be a little bit more generous, be a little bit more understanding, and be more ready to compromise. And I don't think it's and many other people have made this point, it's not a mystery that we have been having these contentious political times at the same time that we're having COVID lockdowns where people can't be with family of the opposite political party. And it's part of the reason also on my channel, I spend a lot of time, way more time than anybody else I know, if I'm going to have a substantive conversation with someone who thinks differently about something as important as religion, I want to first have, especially them, talk about their background. I'm happy to answer questions about my background, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
happy to do disclosure on that, but I want people to tell their story. And after they tell their story, it's a little bit easier to understand how they arrived at the opinions and conclusions they have, and to respect them, and probably to engage more productively in debating the things that are debated. I look at our political realm right now, and do we want more poverty or less? Everyone will say less poverty.
Right, right.
Do we want more fairness or less? Everyone will say more fairness.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the questions we have is how to have less poverty, how to have better health care, how to have more fairness. So those, you're going to have lots of legitimate disagreements on the how to, but maybe we can start with, let's begin with what we agree on. Okay, less poverty, more fairness, less racism. Let's start there and see if we can agree on that. But if you say, no, you don't really care about racism, well, first of all, how do you know that? How do you know what I do and don't care about? How well do you really know me? So again,
Mm-hmm.
so much of this is just up the let's up our capacity for trust by seeing each other in ways that we can see commonality.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a lot of it. And then the real trick is to not be reactive. That's the real trick.
Mm-hmm.
Because if to not be reactive and to be able and willing to absorb pain, it's relatively easy to inflict pain.
Mm-hmm.
It's much more difficult to absorb pain.
Mm-hmm.
So let them insult you. Let them say all kinds of mean things about you. And you say, well, where'd you get an idea? Well, how about the Sermon on the Mount? It's right there.
Mm-hmm.
Blessed are you when people insult you and say all kinds of evil things about you. That's what Jesus says. So
Mm-hmm.
shouldn't Jesus followers count it as blessings when people insult them? It's really hard to learn how to
Mm-hmm.
do, but it's it's right there in the Bible.
Yeah, I had a conversation which I'm gonna upload soon. I talked with Julian. He's like frequents the Randos United channel, and
Yep.
he's a Hutterite. Yeah, and it was really interesting because we talked a lot about that. And this is going to be sort of a subsequent question, like how much does your sort of Christian ethos sort of impact or affect your ability to converse with people? Because we kind of came to a similar conclusion in our conversation, where it was sort of like one of the central tenets of Christianity is to be struck without striking back, or something like that. And so it's sort of like that's what informs my ability to talk with anybody. Is it's sort of like that humanizing, kind of what you described, and having people share their stories. Like I totally agree with you in the sense that it's important to sort of contextualize beliefs and arguments within someone's life. Like, because you're exactly right. We agree on a lot of the fundamental things. Like, let's stop racism, let's feed the hungry, in poverty, that kind of thing. It kind of reminds me of like what was something like, it was in like a Jordan Peterson lecture where he said something like, people go out and protest like against poverty, and it's like, well, that's like, what do you mean? Like, everybody's against poverty. Like that's not really a controversy. That's not something you really need to protest for, or whatever. Like, but yeah, the sort of specifics
Yeah.
is where everybody, that's where people come to blows in a lot of ways. So let me think for a second. Whenever, I guess, so this kind of also feeds into it, because I've also started kind of reading a lot of what James Lindsay has been putting out with that new discourses business about sort of the wokeness, and sort of like all that he rails against in critical race theory and things like that. And I watched this one conversation which they were talking about sort of like protesting tactics, and the idea is that one of the tactics is to bring people to a decision dilemma or something, or dilemma decision, where you kind of get in their face and you yell at them and you make them react to you. And so I guess whenever, I mean, have you ever had people meet you that hostily with your views? I almost find it, I almost can't believe that someone would yell at you. Like, does
Oh
that,
yeah, people yell at me.
like, do they, like, I guess, do you just, I mean, do you literally just not react? Like, are you a stone in some sense? Like, do you just have a flat affect, or do you kind of address their sort of behavior towards you? Like some psychologists call it, you're tethering yourself to the here and now, which is not
Yeah.
something that typically happens in like one-on-one relation, with good friends. You don't typically point out in the moment when something is happening,
Right.
whereas like that's sort of like a big bit in therapy where, the idea is that your pathology will sort of make itself manifest in any one-on-one interaction, and the therapist is to point it out in the here and now. And so, like, do you do that? Do you just say, look, like, how do you sort of handle that in the moment?
I don't always get it right. Let me say that first.
Mm.
And I have plenty of experience trading, debating people on things. I've got plenty of experience, and I still do that. A lot depends on the context, on the relationship. The place, if someone really wants to learn how to do this, the place to start is at home with the people that you share a dwelling with. It might be a spouse, it might be your children, it might be your parents, because those are the arguments that are so common and often very petty.
Mm.
And one of the things that you might learn in a case like that is winning the fight doesn't necessarily help, because what you really want is, are you really annoyed that they're not doing their share around the house in terms of, maybe taking their turn cleaning the kitchen? Yeah, but the bigger things that you want are a degree of commonality and allegiance. And do we want a clean kitchen or not? Yes. Okay. What are we both willing to do to have a clean kitchen? Well, maybe your standards of cleanliness are not where mine are. Okay. Well, then we're going to have to do some negotiation. But what happens within us is that, no, see, this gets into one's Christian belief too, because if you believe that everything in the world is riding now on this political victory, which has now sort of been mediated down into this verbal exchange between me and you about some political point, yeah, you're going to fight like your life depends on it. Well, what if your life doesn't depend on it? What if your life is hidden with Christ in the heavenlies and preserved by him and will be revealed at the time of his appearance? Well, then now I can lose this fight, because, and in almost every case in terms of political argument, I find people arguing about things that they have absolutely no control over. Well, I think the tax rate should be higher. Well, I think minimum wage should be $15. Okay, so you think that. Are you setting the minimum wage? I mean, even if you're a member of Congress, you've got to kind of do it all within your other people. And so what we're participating in is something a fair ways from who's actually making the decisions. So we get caught up in sort of a participatory spirit, and all of that psychology is very reasonable and very well known. We want to be good, loyal tribesmen and women, and that's a good thing. We should be loyal to our tribes. But in almost every case, the little spat you're having on Facebook or Twitter, there's no point to it, And then if you say, well, if I really want to convince my political adversary of my point, what does it actually take to influence people? Well, that takes, and again, this is not mysterious, that takes trust, that takes regard. So it's actually a very effective strategy of influence to build trust with your enemy. Because if they can trust you, at least for maybe not for everything, they might not trust your ideas, they might not trust your perspective, but if at least they can trust your good faith. Well, how do they trust your good faith? Why don't you ask them about how their day has gone? Why don't, if you know that they have a sick child, ask them if their child is feeling better today. Why don't, I mean, and these are just all, I don't want to say that they're tricks. We all know this about each other. And so build the relationship that affords the trust that eventually affords more difficult and productive conversations. None of this is rocket science. And there's a degree of mob possession. It's a sort of demonic possession that takes over people, and social media. And, so lately, my kids have been watching Ink Master. And so we've been watching episodes of Ink Master, where it's this tattooing contest. All those reality shows are the same. And so much, and we kind of watch it because I don't have any tattoos. I intend to never get a tattoo, but I'm pretty amazed at what they can do with tattoos in terms of the art. It's pretty impressive.
It is, yeah, it is out there for sure. Yeah.
But how much of that silly show aren't those people bickering with each other in the house? And for psychological reasons, we're all drawn to that. And it's an attention economy. So if we have AI algorithms that are optimized for attention, all of those algorithms are going to heighten conflict. And so, we're worried about robots getting machine guns to kill us in the street. Well, maybe some of our AI is already, they're not bothering with machine guns. They're just weaponizing us to kill each other. And the AI is doing that in some ways, if that's what you set your AI to do. And I see it as, making, watching on YouTube. It isn't rocket science to figure out how to get a YouTube following or a following on Twitter. Push people's buttons, because people both like to push buttons, and a little part of them likes to have their buttons pushed because they have the hope they're going to be able to push the other buttons harder. And so just ramp that stuff up and you will gain a following. But okay, you've gained a following. Are you burning down the world? So again, none of this is new. We all know this, and we all say we know this.
Right.
Why can't we stop?
Yeah, it seems like there's just a lot of like dissonance and disconnect, from you talk with people, who for all intents, like, so if I have a disagreement with someone, like it may, like I virtually never, at least in my personal life, I would never have that spat online. Like for instance, my sisters like to get a rise out of my mom. At least one of my sisters is super like far left leaning in some sense, and my mom is like, she's in a right wing bunker to a certain degree, and my younger sister has loads and loads and loads and loads of friends. And my mom is kind of naive when it comes to social media, in the sense that she'll get on there and start to argue with my sister on one of her forum posts, or, or one of her, posts. And like, it just like, everybody just starts to sort of like pick her feathers in some sense, like they just kind of, like,
that's right.
Yeah. Like, and she's really not like, I know my mother, she's not as, she's not as bad as she can be set up to be in an online presence, so, and then everybody gets this horrible image of everything. And so like, stuff like that, like and there's sort of like, well, it's exactly like what you're saying in terms of the what would you say, like the attention driven economy, and how conflict sort of drives views, drives likes, drives shares, all of that. Like the contentious view is the one that wins the day in a lot of ways. And there's this subtle meme that kind of runs around where it's sort of like, if I see 50 comments on a Facebook post, I'm going to read them no matter what, because there's an argument there, and so it's sort of like, to me, it almost feels a little bit like I wouldn't call it biological warfare, but more like social warfare, sociological warfare, but like carried out on such a benign level that people don't even really realize how, in some sense, they're being programmed, like you're saying, by these algorithms,
It's
you know,
not
to be
benign.
shown.
It's
Oh,
not
well, sure.
benign. And we're
Mm,
seeing that now.
mm. Yeah, well, yeah, I guess that's true. You know, like it was, I would say, seemingly benign. Like there are some things that like you wouldn't realize how, you know, how much they can sort of take stock in your soul, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, you know, like how much they control your seat of emotions, you know, your heart, you know, like, and so there are a lot of like popular level people who win this following because they're contentious in one way or another, or they, you know, they just have a blatant disregard and disrespect for people in general, you know, like with that whole pranking culture that kind of arose, you know, over the past 10 years or so, where so much so that there was a scandal with there was one popular YouTuber named Logan Paul, and he went into this suicide forest and was like videotaping, you know, things that you obviously shouldn't videotape. But the thing is that he got to such a point that he thought it would be okay to do that, you know, type of radical prank, you know. Um, and I wonder, like, I was thinking about this in terms of like the sort of the degradation of our society's morals in general, and our lack of sort of ability to orient yourself in sort of a meaningful and, I guess, let's say, transcendent way. Like as I think, because we saw it early on in the summer with like that movie Cuties that came out, that was, you know, bad for a number of horrible reasons. But the thing is that like the media team at Netflix, such a large corporation, thought it would be okay to release something like that to the society at large, like one of the most used streaming services, you know. And so the fact that such a large corporation and all their media consultants likely thought, oh yeah, this is a good idea, like, to me points to a significant breakdown in our like moral framework as a society. And I think that, you know, like you're saying with this programming by contentious, you know, media, whether it's Twitter fights, everybody gets into a tweet storm, you know, like, you know, even like just over potentially anything, you know, like I saw everybody was up in arms about J.K. Rowling's new Harry Potter thing, a live action Harry Potter show. And, you know, everybody's boycotting her and really upset with her because of her, her views towards trans people. And yeah, I wonder, I guess, where do, do you see it only sort of, I can only think of it in terms that basically I only see things getting worse, you know, like I only see more and more of this happening, more and more sort of, you know, contentious arguments breaking out, more and more division, less and less humanity, you know, especially with like, you know, more screen time due to COVID, like that drove everything up. And you're right, it did create a perfect storm for the Capitol Hill event. But do you think, and I kind of watched some of your thing today about the church sort of, what would you say, you know, not in some sense being fundamentally changed due to COVID, you know, whether people will return to in person or they'll stay in Zoom, or, you know, how COVID kind of permanently changed that sort of church landscape. Do you think that in some sense, like we'll only drift further away from each other, or like there's there could be some potential sort of maybe unifying movement, or that maybe you see a different trend than I do?
Well, history is really funny. Um, but there is sort of and there's sort of a think about fights. Um, think about fights in your household, say between your sister and your mom. They'll
Mm,
have a big fight, and it'll go bad, and they'll say things, and then after it all quiets down, you know, your mind goes back over it, and you think, "Oh, she's my mom." You know, yeah, okay, maybe she watches Fox all the time. Maybe she
mm-hmm.
loves Donald Trump too much, but she's still my mom, you
Right.
know, and yeah, I'd love to change her politically. And in many cases, things will get bad and then people will come back from it. And, you know, they'll go back and forth and back and forth. And this happens on larger scales too. So every now and then things sort of, you know, go overboard, and you'll
Mm-hmm.
have a civil war, and you'll have things will fall apart sometimes, but they don't always fall apart. And so then the question we ask is, are things going to fall apart now? And we can't say. We can't say. If you look at, let's say, American history in the 19th century before the Civil War, I mean, things get tensions rise, and they go back and forth. The Compromise of 1850, and you just go back and forth until it gets really dangerous when you hit an impasse. And then, but then after the war, then you tend to settle back down again. And in terms of nations, these things take longer times, and sometimes things are lost, lives are lost. But how's it going to happen in our country? I don't know. I hope. I am concerned about the fact that these algorithms are accentuating this, and this isn't unknown. Jonathan Haidt made this point with respect to social media and suicide of girls. And basically, because when boys fight, generally speaking, it's physical. But if you have a couple of teenagers using fists, if they're just using fists, you'll get some bloody nose and you'll get some hurt feelings, but they're not, as long as they aren't knives and guns,
Right.
they'll find a way to make peace. But girls are fighting reputationally. And like you described, the pile-on, now, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me. No, words, because we are at least 50% and probably more non-physical beings. And so those relational things, especially for girls and women, those relational things really matter. And so you will get breakups and breakdowns, and you will get people who can't talk to a son or a parent, a daughter or a mother for generations. But there's enough in the culture. There's a lot of things that go into that. And usually, okay, what are the other structures around them? Will they have a mutual friend that will say, hey, she's your mom? When you were a little girl and you got sick, and you puked in your bed, and she came up and cleaned up and comforted you, you didn't ask her who she voted for. She loves you. And same thing, she's your daughter. You invested years of your life, you sacrificed how many hours and how much money into her well-being, and all you really want is to have this silly political thing end in an embrace. And 10 years from now, you're not going to feel about Donald Trump what you feel now on either side. So, and so then there are other people in the life that will say, hey, okay, you don't like her politics. You know what? It's a vote. All right. What you two have is way more important than the vote. And so stop the insanity and make up. And most of the time, that will prevail. But the problem is, see, that's why it isn't just the conflict. It's the matrix of relationships and institutions and practices and memories. It's all of those containers that we slowly build throughout our life, that those things then really matter.
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree. Oh, my dog just tried to break in. This is like a false wall basically behind me, like an accordion wall. And she likes to bust through sometimes, like the Kool-Aid man.
Fine. The dog can join the podcast.
Yeah. But yeah, so the idea that, I understand exactly what you're talking about, because so early on in, like, I initially became a Christian, and then I fell into this sort of like typical apologetics phase where I was reading all these books, and like I had the canned arguments for God's existence, whatever they, ontological, cosmological, kalam, like all those, like the standard arguments you hear running around in apologetics communities today. And I wanted to become like a logic chopper, basically. Like I wanted to I took a logic class. Like I wanted to be able to do this thing to people where I could argue with them and I could just, as they brought objections, I could just stomp them out systematically, and I thought that would be the way, I thought that would be the way to convert people to my, like to make them think like me in some sense, and uh, so and I thought that was really important, and I thought that would be really useful to do, and I also thought that people thought that way. I thought, never mind that I wasn't really converted by logical arguments or anything like that, and in fact, if at the time, someone came to me with that sort of line of conversation, I'd be like, whoa, buddy, like I don't really, like I get you're zealous about this, but it's not really, my cup of tea or whatever. And I got so much so into that camp that, so much so into logic chopping, so much so into these systematic arguments for God's existence, that I remember I was talking with one of the guys I lived with, and this was close to my conversion because I was still living with everybody that I lived with. They were like strident atheists, like they didn't believe, like, and it was weird to them that I did start believing in this thing and start going to church instead of, staying up and doing whatever, and so like, I was talking with him, I was arguing with him about the existence of a soul, which we were just driving back from Taco Bell, so and the conversation wasn't at all like that, but that was just how my mind went. Like,
Sure.
there was dead air. I would just start to talk about these arguments basically.
Yeah.
And it got to such a point that we were driving through the subdivision, and he opened the door and got out of the moving car to get away from me. And we were going like 20, 25 miles an hour, and he literally rolled on the ground to get away from and walked home. And, at that time, I still didn't quite have the force, or I didn't really have the insight rather to recognize like, oh, I should change my tactics up. Like I shouldn't talk like this to people. Basically, I shouldn't, the general public, they don't really, in the people in your lives, they don't really want you to do that basically, like they don't, and nor would they be convinced otherwise, it wasn't really until maybe about a year later where I was arguing with someone. We were texting because, like that was just how we communicated. And so because he was in the military, and we went through all these, like a lot of these arguments, and then finally just like stopped responding to me for a long time. And it was like that one where I was like, okay, I'm not doing this right. Like I'm not trying to convince people the right way, basically. And so now, that was 3 years ago or so. And so like now I'm considerably different in my tact and approach and how I even convince people. But it was that exactly how you're describing, that sort of like thinking back. Like it did take a while because I'm pretty dense, but it took a while but eventually that sort of remorse sort of kicked in and was like, okay, maybe it's not the case that, I'm in the right all the time in terms of these conversations. And in some sense, I had this undergirding principle too, which I see a lot in Christian circles, because I used to talk with this one guy who was a young earth creationist, and he did not like me very much in whenever we had these conversations, and he said, like we dealt amicably with each other in terms of, like, we weren't mean spirited about it, but he would always cite times at which people were, very visibly upset with him, and he tied it back to the idea that in some sense it's good to be hated for Christ's sake, or that, Christians in general will be hated to some capacity. And what I saw in him was not that he was being hated for his, Christianness, but rather for his unchristianness, like for his sort of like brutal assertion of, what he thought to be the science of the time. And like the stuff like that, like it was just very bullheaded, very like uncharitable, just like if I said anything contrary to the doctrines he was espousing, it was almost as if I was an unchristian, like not just that I was not a Christian, but that I was doing something fundamentally worse than not being a Christian, as in tainting, sacred, the sacred doctrine of creation, things like that, you know. So I wonder, you know, like, I think we, like, now my Christian belief informs me in a different way in some sense, you know, like the idea that I should be struck without striking back, you know. So like if someone gets upset with me and calls me a name, it's like I'm under oath to not do that to them, you know.
Yeah, yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah.
but in the same way that my Christian belief informs me to do that, and your Christian belief informs you to do that, like this guy's Christian belief informed him to be this sort of monster, and you know,
Yeah.
maybe, and so I guess how do you sort of how do you I'm trying to think of the way to form the question, because I rambled for a bit there, but I think maybe how do you sort of handle someone that has sort of like this sort of transcendent ethic that they think that they're almost ordained by God to upset people, you know?
It's not different from the other kind of examples we were talking about.
Yeah.
You know, it's very interesting how, you know, there's all kinds of questions that one might ask in this realm. If logic chopping apologetics was the primary vehicle God would use to achieve his goals, why isn't there more of it in the Bible?
Right.
The Bible doesn't look that way. You know, what is the Bible full of? You know, Christians, you've got Christians out there that are making all of these arguments why the Bible is the inspired, inerrant word of God, and almost everything that they're you know, sending out there looks nothing like what they said God sent out there.
Mm.
And that must just cause you to pause for a moment and, you know, look at, okay, so you're arguing that Jesus is the ultimate revelation of God. Good. Okay, what does that ultimate revelation look like?
Mm.
How does that ultimate revelation talk? What does
Mm.
that ultimate revelation do? You know, Jesus, I often go back to the first chapter of the book of Acts. Jesus says that, after the crucifixion, after the resurrection, after they've seen him eat a fish, Jesus' disciples say, "Now will you restore the kingdom to Israel?" Now that tells us a lot about what was on the disciples' mind. And read the if you read the Old Testament, if you read the prophets, it's not, if you know something about the Second Temple period, it's not hard to understand what the disciples wanted from Jesus. And then if you look at Jesus and you listen to him, you'll notice that even at this point, the disciples really don't have much of a clue about what Jesus had been doing. Now, that they're going to get a better clue when you get to Acts 2 and the coming of the Holy Spirit. But what does that mean? And of course, all of these gospel accounts are written, you know, a little while after the fact, after one way or another, the church sort of has an idea together. They've got plenty of division, you know, circumcision, no circumcision, meat sacrifice to idols, you know, sleeping with prostitutes. I mean, all of these, they got lots of questions. They got lots of divisions. They're rife with conflict. I mean, you can't read the New Testament closely and not see there's tremendous conflict going on around this emergent Christianity that is coming to be. But Jesus, if you read the testimony of him in the Bible, in the four gospels, and, you know, other places in Paul too, Jesus is astoundingly, you know, what we would call in psychological terms today, differentiated. And it isn't the case that Jesus is a floor mat. No, Jesus is sometimes very much not nice. You know,
Mm.
Jesus will say things to people that most pastors would never say. But Jesus is Jesus in all of this is bearing witness to something. And then when you come to Acts 1, Jesus says to them, you will be my witnesses. Now, that doesn't mean that, I love the frankness at the end of the book of Acts when Paul's been up and down and up and down, and he sort of, he goes to Jerusalem and they want to kill him, and so he gets himself arrested so that he won't be killed, and then there's going to be a plot to take his life, and so then word gets out, and so where Jesus was killed by Roman soldiers, now Paul is being protected by Roman soldiers, and then Paul goes to Festus, and Paul decides he's going to make a play. He's going to make an evangelistic play. And Festus says, come on, are you trying to convert me now? And this is right in the book of Acts. I mean, it's this kind of honesty that we see in the New Testament about, and Paul's like, hey, I took my shot. But slowly, generation after generation after generation, this thing builds. And so if we are such short-sighted creatures that we think, okay, I'm going to do all of this converting right now with people. Now, in my tradition, which is, more Calvinism, I don't convert people. The Holy Spirit does that. As Paul says, I play a part. Maybe I plant a seed. Maybe I water that seed. Maybe I do a little something. What I want usually in sort of a tribal interchange is I want to, it's like the World War II fighters where, I want to put a swastika on the side of my plane to show how many Germans I shot down. No, this is not about me. This in some ways isn't even about you. This is all about Christ and his mission. So I'm not going to be anxious with you. And when I first started making YouTube videos, I would get emails and comments regularly. Most of these people sort of gave up on my channel, I think, where someone would write me an email after I'd have a conversation with someone who wasn't a Christian, and they'd say, you didn't present the gospel to him. What if he dies tonight? And it's like, I think actually I was being Christ's witness. And I also believe that God is in the heavens, and I have a very strong sense of providence, and I believe in the power of the Holy Spirit, and I believe in God's sovereign decisions over our world and over our lives, and it's my job to be a witness. That is my job. And sometimes that might involve logical argumentations, and if people want to talk that way, I'm happy to have a debate with them. Very pleased. It's fun. But I'm under no preconceptions that at the end of it, they'll say, you know what? I believe God is real, and I'm going to be a Christian right now. Now, I've seen that happen, but most of the time it happens in the pastor's study, and a lot of stuff has happened before it, and they don't have a YouTube channel, which is all about debunking the other tribe. Okay. Yeah. So, I can play that game. That game is fun to play. I like playing that game. But that game is just in that little box. And what I really care about is I'm to be his witness. And again, we see it all the time. Just read biographies of Christian people in past centuries. There's a little book I have of conversion stories. Almost every case, it's something that happened over here, and something my father said, and something over here. And that's why we say the Holy Spirit converts people, because it's not usually just one person. So I don't know why Christians suddenly have gotten so dumb. Well, although the disciples weren't real bright. So it's all in the book. Why don't we read it, and why don't we do it?
Yeah, man, that what you've said is, resonates a lot with me. And what would you say? Like a former version of myself would be in total revolt, because I was, that idea that, that it's this little thing over here, that it's what your dad said, or what your, you know, what your mom said to you, or what the pastor says in the study after many sessions, things like that. Like, I did not, you know, it's almost like I was almost like, I don't even know, the only word that's coming to mind is like colonized by this online sort of, you know, we'll bring it back into that conflict algorithm in some sense, you know, like all the videos debunk this, debunk that, you know, destroy this, destroy that, you know, logic and facts and reason and intelligence and, you know, things like that, you know. And it's like, I think that, I think the amount of time that I spent online watching things like that, reading things like that, you know, just being entrenched in communities that center around, you know, behavior like that, it sort of gave me a sort of a false understanding of how people form their beliefs and how conversation is really meant to function, and you know, things like that. Um, and so it definitely turned me into more of a blight on the world rather than a light on the world. And so I wonder how much I wonder, I guess I I basically am always trying to think of how to sort of disarm people, like point swords down and things like that. Like, so like if I had like recently I had a dinner with all my family, and like I would say 90% of them are still, you know, the election is a fraud, like up in arms about
Yeah,
this. And
yeah,
like some of them are, you know, there was one family gathering where it was almost like, boy, I don't know. It was almost like so basically someone literally stood up and pointed at the only person who didn't, you know, I won't say the only person, but the only person who vocally did not support Trump at the dinner,
yeah,
and was like, tell me right now why you think this and this about,
yeah,
you know, why you think this tax, why, you know, all that, like as if she had to answer for, you know, all of this, you know, as if one, her opinion even really played an important role in the fabric of like of our political system. You know, it was almost as if her mere existence upset them for some
yeah,
reason, you know. And
yeah. It's helpful in moments like that to ask yourself, okay, what? Okay, we're talking politics and we're talking
mm,
tax policy and we're talking
mm-hmm,
all these other things. What do people around this table, what are they really looking for? Well, they're probably looking to be respected. They're probably looking to be loved. They're probably looking to be reassured. Now, the avenue by which we're trying to find these things is it's taken on a certain form, and it's
mm,
this political debate about Donald Trump and tax policy and whatnot. And I think the best, I think, if you want to, I mean, actually, in many ways, those are opportunities to practice some of this. And so try practicing being honest. So when maybe they make a point that you disagree with, agree with that point. Say, you know, that's a really good point, and I'm going to have to think more about that. And when you show that willingness to be influenced, they will probably reciprocate by finding ways to be influenced. And don't pick the most gnarly, hardest thing that would humiliate them.
mm,
Find a point that's sort of in the gray area between you and say, well, what about this point? You know, the and and again, if the more you know about the political debates, the better you can do with this. And then I often simply point to, you know, I just saw that. So Trump, um, you know, Trump took off all of the travel restrictions right before he left office.
mm-hmm,
Biden put them on and put one on South Africa.
mm-hmm,
And I think if Trump had put a travel restriction on South Africa, we would have heard the charge of racism.
mm-hmm,
Now, I don't think, you know, it's, well, I know what's in Donald Trump's heart. Do you really? Because my guess is you don't. My guess is
mm-hmm.
you have a picture. Maybe you're right. Maybe you're wrong. But did Joe Biden put a travel restriction on South Africa because of racism? Because he doesn't like black people? or maybe a travel restriction on that South Africa because they had a history of apartheid. I mean, the problem with almost all of these things is that people are assuming and implying one criteria of relevance when, if you know just a little bit more, and if you remember just a little bit more history, you can sometimes, just in the form of a question, post a question which will begin to sort of undo that assumption, which is really a presumption. And don't do it like a jerk. Just do it gently, and just make it once and then back off of it. Again, it's all stuff that you learn in dealing with people when they're upset. You know, I walked into the supermarket one day and there was a guy, and he was a homeless guy, and he had, you know, I don't exactly, he was just a little bit short of money. And, you know, because he was a homeless guy, they'd kind of, the security guard was coming around him, and, you know, and the situation was just escalating. I've got a lot of experience with homeless people. And so I just kind of, but I could just read the checkout girl didn't want a confrontation. The security guard didn't want to tackle this homeless guy. The store manager didn't want a problem, but they all got themselves in a place where the homeless guy had his, you know, it was because the homeless guy had his bike in the store. The homeless guy didn't want to lose his bike.
Right.
And he was short. He was like short 4 cents. And the guy behind him in line, you know, he didn't want to have his day. You know, this could have gone wrong in how many different ways. And all I did was I stepped in. I had a very calm demeanor. I looked at the homeless guy. I engaged him in a gracious way. I said, "Would you like me to hold your bike for you while we figure this out?" And, you know, everyone wanted to de-escalate. And so he looked at me and he saw the chance at de-escalating, and he said yes. And so I looked at the security guard. "Would it be okay if I just held his bike right here while we resolve this?" He wanted to de-escalate. Yes. And then, you know, the guy behind him in line said, here's, you know, the extra 25 cents so we can cover his beer. And, you know, and so, okay, the store was satisfied. The bill was fully paid. He got his beer. I walked him out with the bike, gave him his bike. Everybody's day went on. And that situation could have gone all kinds of bad for no good reason, where cops could be called, altercation, restraining order. And so it's just like, chances are in that room, they want to make peace with their family member who's on the opposite political side. Look at the situation, understand the goal, find a way. And if this happens again and again and again and again online, in households around the country, over dinner, in marriages, politically we'll all be happier. And now just doing that at Little Bel Air Market, just on Florin Road, means nothing. But what did I do right there? Now the checkout girl remembers what I did. The security guard remembers what I did. The guy behind in line remembers what I did. And now they've all got a script for the next time something like this happens. Let's just de-escalate this, okay? We're talking 4 cents, an alcoholic, a bike, and a beer.
Yeah, you know, there are a couple big points there that I thought of while you were talking. You know, like that idea, de-escalation. Like, I totally agree in some sense that they're like, everyone there definitely wanted de-escalation. I can imagine that some people maybe my age or younger would have got their smartphones out and maybe wanted escalation, or at least they want their 15 seconds of fame or however long, you know, they want their TikTok of some guy throwing his bike over the counter and smashing a, you know, 12 pack on the ground or whatever. Like, that's what they want sometimes, you know, like, you know, and like, I try to have that sort of positive view that people generally want peace. People generally want de-escalation, but this sort of Gen Z, you know, Zoomers, you know, even younger millennials, like in some sense, what I see is that they want chaos in a lot of ways, you know, like they don't have anything to really, you know, how did I hear it put once? They're sort of like a lot of generations sort of, there was a lot of things to rebel against basically. And the newest generation has the least to rebel against, you know, and so they sort of like, and so they basically rebel against everything, you know, and it just comes out as incoherent screeching to some degree, you know, like we want progress. Where do we want it? Nowhere. Where do, you know, like it's like that kind of thing, you know, like it's a lot of like this sort of like cyclical self-defeating sort of thing. But the thing that I think that was like what you said was really important is that idea of developing scripts for other people in that sense where you were able to be that archetype or that exemplar figure that they can now model future behavior after. And to me that resonates deeply because, well, you know, I grew up with a social disorder, and to some degree I still am affected by it. And for me, having scripts, you know, a script, that's very important. Like it makes it so much easier for me to talk if I have a script. Like I couldn't order food. Like even I frequently ask my wife, how should I say this? Like, I want this guy, I want to hang out with this guy for dinner, but like, how do I ask that? You know, like things like that. Or like, how do I, or like, if I want an extra set of silverware, like I literally have to have scripts in my mind, like a sets of like phraseology that I can use in circumstances, which for me I'm better now, obviously, but typically before, you know, like I couldn't interact or engage in any of those avenues if I did not have a pre-assembled script, you know. So like, and I think that there's, you know, we've lost our scripts for our moral code to some degree, like our ability to step in and intervene in a situation like that. Like it takes particular moral characters to be able to do something like that, you know. Like most people don't have scripts for you know, de-escalating domestic abuse on the street, or you know, things like that. Like that's atypical behavior, you know. Like most people, what do you hear, the bystander effect, you just, you know, try to ignore what's going on over there and not step in. But then there are characters of extreme moral fiber that do something extraordinary and that sort of lift the bar up for everybody, you know. Like you left the bar up for 4 people, you know. But I'm reading a book called All the Shining Things. It was co-authored by Hubert Dreyfus, who was like a Berkeley, very awesome dude. He wrote What Computers Can't Do, and then What Computers Still Can't Do, or something. And this book, it's How to Find Meaning in a Secular Age. But he talks about this guy who, you may actually know the news story, but he jumped onto the rails. A guy had an epileptic fit in the subway tunnel and fell down onto the rails. And this guy jumped off the platform, had his 2 little girls with him, and jumped off the platform and got the guy in between the rails, and the subway passed over him and he held him down, and they both came out unscathed, you know. And so like that guy, and he didn't, you know, he's one of those extreme moral characters, you know, extreme moral fiber or something like that, you know. Like, and he affected, well, you know, that was picked up by the news and iterated and shown to thousands of people, and in particular everybody on that platform watched him do that, you know. And so I guess, like, you know, that, so, you know, that idea of helping other people develop scripts through our actions. And I guess that's sort of, you know, that's what also the Christian calls being a witness or something, you know, like to be something to emulate Christ so that others can emulate you emulating Christ, and so on and so forth. And yeah, I guess.
Well, I think, I mean, Dallas Willard liked to emphasize the difference between training and trying. We might hear this idea and say, well, here's an ideal. I like that ideal, and I'd like to be the kind of person that did that. Well, you might not be able to be that kind of person right now. And the way you become that kind of person is usually you see something that you say, ooh, that's worthy of attaining for. So there's a lot of Jordan Peterson stuff in here. I'd like to be that kind of person. Okay, how do you become that kind of person? Maybe you're a kid and you grew up, and when you're 8 years old or 10 years old, the Olympics were on, and they come every 4 years. So, you know, when you're 10 years old and the Olympics come on, you've never seen the Olympics before, and you're watching downhill skiing, or you're watching swimming, or you're watching track and field, and you're like, wow, I wanna be able to do that. Okay, well, here's the good news. Maybe if you're living someplace like this, you can do this someday. Here's the bad news. It's going to take a lot of your life in order to be able to even try to be that fast or that good. And so I think about the civil rights movement, and it is not incidental that Dr. King was a pastor of churches, because what he leveraged in that movement was not just a bunch of idealistic youth, but what he leveraged was generations of church going where people had been filled with a message that their master and their God was Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ, at the center of the story, lays down his life for his enemies. And so can we not see the relationship between these marchers of people? Yeah, they had ideas from Gandhi and Tolstoy, and they were able to take on these ideas, but they took on these ideas and they practiced them. And, Dr. King and his nonviolence, I mean, if they saw that someone was really reactive, no, you can't march with us, because we don't want to get into downtown and have you smashing windows, because
Right.
that completely undermines our moral quality and our moral witness. That is not, you cannot be with us and do that. If you march with us, they will sick dogs on you. They will put fire hoses on you. They will call you names. They will say almost anything to trigger you. And they even trained for this. I mean, if you're going to sit at a lunch counter, you had to undergo training to demonstrate to each of them that you were not going to fight back. And that's how they won the war. Now, there's a whole lot of stuff around that. And it worked with Gandhi in India. It worked with, I don't know that it would have worked in Nazi Germany. I don't know that it would have worked in the Soviet Union. But the point is, if you want to be like Jesus, go into discipleship training of Jesus to become like Jesus. And you'd say, boy, I wonder if we had like a training program to be like Jesus, what would that involve? Well, we'd need like people to be around them, and we'd need people to read the primary sources, and those people might want a building so when it rained they didn't get wet, and where they were listening and practicing, and it might involve chanting, and maybe, boy, we chant better if we add a little bit of music to it. We'll call that singing. And if you start to think about this, there's a reason the church has developed. Now, there's plenty of mess and distraction and dead ends and wrong turns, and there's all of that too. But when you think about it, you think, how would that one man pouring 3 years into a group of disciples, how would he so dramatically change the world that when you're doing arguments with atheists, the truth is they've been so thoroughly colonized by Jesus in terms of a whole bunch of their moral presumptions, they don't even see it anymore. And when they're complaining about Christians not being loving or kind, well, they probably have some points.
Yeah.
But that's within a whole nother area. You can go through all the rest of it, but that's how thoroughly Jesus won.
Yeah.
And nobody recognizes it.
Yeah.
And so once you recognize it, well, don't squander the winnings. Just let them argue that we should be nicer to gays and trans people, and let them understand that beating children and abusing them let them make that point. Yeah, Jesus made that point. Let them score Christian points, and you don't have to face it. You don't have to point it out every time they do it, but let them and smile.
Yeah. I'm right there with you in terms of letting them score Christian points, essentially, because what C.S. Lewis had at this point about people don't really understand like the idea of in some sense, like best, better, worst, you know, like he would talk about things like, yeah, I don't like this, but I really don't like this, so I would prefer that, you know, like I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but, you know, like I guess one would be like, you know, I really don't like violence or whatever, you know, I don't like people getting beat up in the streets, you know, like and I would prefer our police didn't do that. But if there are people beating people up on the streets, I'd rather our police, you know, exercise violence to subdue a murderous criminal or something like that, you know. So stuff like, you know, stuff like that, where it's sort of like, yeah, I may not agree in whole, like wholesale with the ethos of, you know, a lot of my secular friends, but like I routinely have long conversations with my friend who studies political science, and he, you know, like we're coming, and he's non-religious, like atheist, you know, and I'm deeply religious, you know, and so we you know, but we agree on loads and loads and loads of things, loads of topics and conversation points and things like that, partly because like, well, he's sort of like of the old guard in that sense, you know, like there are some people who are not completely like bought into that the sort of the postmodern ideal, you know, like that where he still recognizes, like for instance, he's read like Dostoevsky, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, like he reads legitimate, you know, books, and he doesn't get, you know, he doesn't like he accepts that there are things that can be true and there are things that can be false, and like coming from that sort of basis, like we disagree on some like fundamental things, but in terms of like acting out certain moral actions in the world, or things that we think would be good, you know, to bring about, like he gets there, you know. Boy, this is something that, and it reminds me of, I think it's something Paul says, you know, some preach the gospel for vainglory, other for selfish desire. But I say, glory to God, so long as the gospel is preached. By any means necessary, the gospel goes forward. Right. Something like that, you know, like it's something basically that, you know, like I don't really exactly what you're saying. It doesn't matter how you get to these sort of moral conclusions, that they go forward is to the glory of God in some sense, you know.
That's right. That's right. That's right. No, that's very true. And so, you know, we live in an amazing time. And, you know, I spent the first part of my career overseas as a foreign missionary in a very poor place, working with people who had far harder lives than you and I have. And we live in an amazing time with amazing liberties, amazing freedoms, amazing opportunities, amazing comforts. And yeah, is there stuff to be scared of? Absolutely. Could we lose all this? Yeah, we could blow it. Human beings do on a very regular basis. But, you know, perhaps a little bit of gratitude for everything that we have. And in addition to that, an understanding that, you know, the benefits and the blessings we have were paid for by past generations and the sacrifices they made. So maybe a little bit of willingness to be able to sacrifice something. And that might be something as easy as somebody on another tribe making a point that you don't like. Okay. He made the point. Endure it. You know, I taught a class a few years ago because on dealing with adult children. And I made the point in that class that is a point that just about applies to almost everything. In almost everything, your ability to succeed is directly related to your ability to absorb a degree of pain. It's true for the little kid who watches the Olympics and says, I want to be a sprinter. Okay, you're going to have to absorb a lot of pain and suffering if you want to get that fast. And you may never get there because there's some genetics going on there too, probably at that level. You want to raise an adult child and you want to have a good relationship, you're going to have to learn to endure pain. Well, what kind of pain? Well, when they insult you, when they vote for a candidate that you think is evil, when they espouse and promote ideas and opinions, religious or political, or even in just other ways that you think are wrongheaded and are leading the world to catastrophe, you're going to have to decide, is now the right time to do what? To take away their agency? Few people respond well to that. So if you really want to, think about someone who plays poker. How do you succeed at poker? You have a poker face. Well, what's a poker face? You lift up and you look at those cards and they're awful. And you don't say, ah, you will lose at poker every time. What does it take to hold a poker face? You absorb pain. You don't flinch. Learn to absorb pain. And if you do, and again, the worst pains are the psychic pains. If you do, well, there's great power in that. Well, how will you use that power? So it's a life lesson.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's actually kind of a beautiful note to end on, really. We've been talking for a bit over an hour now, and yeah, I mean, I've enjoyed it, and I got so curious because I started to see more of these sort of what'd you say, maybe these like sort of debunking type people coming into your sphere of YouTube in that sense, where like I thought that there were almost like non-overlapping areas of magisteria, like there was like the Paul Vanderclays, the Jonathan Pageaus, the Vervakis over here, and then there's like the rationality rules, cosmic skeptic, and like all these other guys over here acting in this other apologetic sphere. But then now they're starting to, in some sense, cross over or maybe they were always aware.
Well, I do play a game, and I will poke at rationality rules. I will poke at him sometimes, and that's why when Nathan decides to poke at me, that's part of the game, and that game is fun too. I mean, I like playing that game. That can be fun. I've certainly played it enough, but there are deeper and subtler and more gratifying games, and in many ways, our lives are not games. We should treat each other with deadly seriousness. And of course, Lewis spoke, wrote well about that in terms of, if Christians believe what they say, their book says, and these other people are image bearers of God, and they ought to be treated that way. So, I'll do some, and I'll play that game on Twitter sometimes. And usually for me, it's an attempt to, well, let's have a deeper conversation. Let's have a better conversation, because I've done plenty of the other game. And again, I don't think there's anything wrong with that game. I think we learn from that game, but most of the learning is happening in the stands. And actually, most of the learning isn't even at the conscious level. It's sort of back in the, back in the impressions level at other layers of our consciousness. But no, I hope these two worlds will come together, and we will, the thing is, if you're a celebrity atheist and you're deep in this game, you might not want to talk to me, because and to some degree your game depends on straw manning and putting a cut up, this is what a Christian pastor looks like. And someone say, well, Paul doesn't look like that. Look at all the hours of conversations he has with all of these people. And Paul and an atheist walk into a bar and they have a drink and they leave as friends. I got lots of atheist friends in my life, and many Christians do. And many atheists have lots of Christian friends in their life. And so I think, especially in times like these, if instead of just wanting to score points, and again, scoring, if I play basketball, I want to run up the score. If I play cards, I want to win. But if I'm dealing with another human being, what are my marching orders from my master? Love your neighbor all the way up to and including your enemy. That's my matching. Those are my matching orders from the one I say is my master. Okay. How am I going to do that? Well, it's hard. So that's what we do.
Yeah. And I think you do it well. And I agree. Like, playing the game is a lot of fun, and playing the game in some sense, what Nathan was playing the game, and was able to have this conversation with you, and you became human to him, and so.
Well, he and I had spoken before too.
Oh, okay.
You go back in my channel, you'll find one or two conversations with him before.
I see.
So, I'd first caught he'd first caught my attention. We had done his video about how I became a
Hmm.
Christian because of Jordan Peterson. It's like, well,
Hmm.
that's kind of in my little area.
Right,
So
right.
people were telling me about it. So I had a conversation with him, and
Mm.
I'm not at all surprised that, and so then when I talked to him again, I wanted to hear his story, because you
Yeah,
were on YouTube talking about how Jordan Peterson made you a Christian. Now you're on YouTube, complaining about Christians. What happened? I just
right.
want to hear the story.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you decide Christians are jerks and you hate them and you want to call me names, you go right ahead. I don't have a problem with that, really.
Mm.
But I'd far rather just have a conversation with you. And, in these weird relationships we have in the internet now, because it's all a little
Hmm.
different than in real life, but
Yeah.
let's at least be able to talk with one another, because if we actually have a good faith conversation,
Mhm.
I can learn more. Because the truth is, I know a lot about the shortcomings of Christianity and
Mm.
the church and Christians. I know a lot about it. I'm there
Yeah.
all the time. So, but it's actually helpful for me to hear your opinion too. And I'm
Mm.
not threatened by that.
Mm.
So,
That it kind of reminds me a little bit about G.K. Chesterton when he talks about having the hard conversation, when he says, I could use 6, 7, 8 syllable words for an hour and a half, and you won't see the slightest moving of the gray matter in my skull. But if I say Sally ought to hug her mother, like that, that's a whole different ballpark. Like that, there's concretes involved. Like that's a difficult conversation to have. Like Sally needs to make up with her mother is much more that's more difficult to sort of wrestle with, and sort of like the I don't even know what technical terms I could use, the hippocampus triggers on 6 or 7 firing lines and whatever. Like you could imagine a conversation in which you could attempt to say the same thing without having any really reaction in the person saying those things. And I think in some sense, like I don't think that's limited to, like, I don't think you can't use large words in conversations. That's not really the point I'm trying to make.
right.
Really, rather that having a conversation one-on-one with you is a lot more meaningful, and a lot more can happen than pulling up 10 quotes and dunking on fundamentalist evangelicals
Yeah.
in the southern United States or whatever. Like
Yeah.
that I don't, you can do that without the slightest twitching of your gray matter, but like to sit
Yeah.
down with Paul Vanderklay for an hour and a half, I think that or Paul Vanderklay like figure, like that gets you thinking. Like I've been told that Christians are dogmatic evil people, and well, I
Yeah.
sat and talked with
Sometimes.
Paul, so, yeah. Oh sure, yeah, yeah, sometimes they're
Catch me
manipulative.
being
Sometimes
dogmatic and evil.
yeah.
My wife catches me doing that all the time.
Yeah. True, fair enough.
And she
Yeah.
can lean on me in ways you'll never be able to. So
Yeah.
that's just the way life works.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, I mean, I've really enjoyed our conversation. I don't know if you had any other
No,
points
no,
to
this has
make
been
or
wonderful. I
awesome.
recorded it too.
Hmm.
I don't know. Did you record it? Do you need me to send you the copy or?
I did record it. I used a
Okay.
different program
Okay.
because I have a lot I technical things, but
Okay. Okay.
yeah.
Is this something that you want me to wait until you share it first, or how do you want to work that?
No, you can go ahead and you can share it whenever your schedule is that
Okay.
you would share this. So
All right. Very good. Sounds good.
yeah,
Thank you, Adam. This has
awesome.
been a
Yeah,
pleasure.
thank you. It's always a pleasure with you, Paul.
All
Thanks.
right. Take care.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.